The garage at Monroe Mobility's Warren facility smelled of coolant and burned plastic. 7 in the evening, and the demo car for tomorrow's Singapore investors was failing on the lift. 3 engineers leaned over diagnostic screens that refused to give them an answer. Caleb Ward passed the bay, glanced once at the voltage trace, and said to the youngest technician, Module 14, "Listen to the cooling fan." Adelaide Monroe heard him from across the floor. She turned, her heels sharp on the concrete. "Mr. Ward, when I want a mechanic's guess, I'll ask. You'll never be more than a mechanic." She had just brushed off the only right answer in the room, and never once asked herself why a mechanic knew it before her engineers did. Have you ever looked at someone and decided they were just something, only to find out later you were wrong? The apartment on the second floor of a brick walk-up in Hamtramck was quiet by 6 in the morning. Caleb Ward had already started the coffee maker and was cracking eggs into a bowl when his daughter Hazel padded out of her room, blanket trailing behind her like a tail. She climbed onto a stool at the counter, watching him work, and announced that her teacher was going to show them how to draw perspective today, and that perspective meant making things far away look small without actually being small. Caleb told her that was a useful trick and slid a plate of eggs and toast across the counter. They ate together, the radio low, and Hazel did most of the talking. Her hair still carried the indentation of her pillow. Caleb watched her without seeming to, the way he watched most things. He had not always lived this way. 3 years ago he had owned a closet of pressed shirts and a calendar he could barely read, and the woman who had picked out those shirts had been alive and laughing in this same kitchen. Now there were 2 bowls in the cupboard and a child who needed to be at Wilson Elementary by 7:45. The drive to the school took 11 minutes. They stopped at the coffee shop on the corner of Joseph Campau, where the owner, a Polish woman named Mrs. Kowal, knew Hazel by name and slid her a small paper cup of hot chocolate without being asked. Caleb paid in cash, the way he paid for almost everything, and walked his daughter to the school gate. He bent down, tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, and told her he would be at the gate at 3. She nodded, serious, and went inside. The drive from Hamtramck to the Monroe Mobility Fleet facility in Warren was 22 minutes on a good day. Caleb drove a Ford F-150 that had 290,000 miles on the odometer and a small dent in the tailgate from a deer in 2018. He liked the truck. He liked that nobody in the employee lot ever looked at it twice. His badge said C. Ward, Maintenance 2. He had been at the company for 14 months, and in that time he had turned down 2 offers to test for Tier 3. His reason, when pressed, was always the same. Tier 2 ended at 4 o'clock. Tier 3 did not. There was a child at a school gate at 3. The garage itself was a long, clean building with 18 bays and a glassed-in supervisor's office at the far end. Walter Briggs ran the floor. He was 62, a Vietnam-era Navy veteran, and he had worked at Arden Powertrain Systems from 2008 to 2014, which meant he had been in the same building as Caleb Ward for 6 of those years. When Caleb had walked into Walt's office 14 months earlier with a thin resume and asked for a job, Walt had taken one long look at him, set the resume aside, and asked only one question. Caleb's answer had been a single sentence. "Don't say anything. I need an ordinary job." Walt had agreed, and had kept his word, and the 2 men had never spoken of it again. Inside Caleb's locker, behind a clean rag and a thermos, there was a small photograph of a woman in a white blouse standing beside a production line. He did not look at it often. He did not need to. 13 miles south, on the 38th floor of Monroe Tower in downtown Detroit, Adelaide Monroe was running her morning board meeting. The room had a view of the river and Windsor on the other side, and she had chosen it on purpose when the company moved in 2 years earlier. She wanted her directors to see the border every time they sat down. Borders, she liked to say, were the only thing that focused the mind. She was 34 years old. Her father, a retired Midwest logistics executive, had taught her how to read a profit and loss statement before she could drive. At 28, she had raised her first round and bought a small electric fleet startup out of Cleveland with the proceeds. 6 years later, Monroe Mobility built work vans and short-haul delivery trucks at 3 facilities across Michigan and Ohio, and the company carried a private valuation of $1.8 billion. The press had been kind to her. The cover of Crain's Detroit had called her, without irony, the most disciplined operator under 40 in the Midwest. The board meeting that morning was about the Aegis 7, the new flagship work vehicle scheduled to begin commercial delivery in September. Brennan Hale, her chief operating officer, stood at the head of the long oak table and walked the directors through the launch timeline. He was 47, gray at the temples, with the easy posture of a man who had been winning small arguments for a long time. He had been with the company 7 years. Della trusted him completely, in the way one trusts a thing one has not yet had a reason to doubt. He laid out the schedule. Commercial launch in September. Defense Logistics Agency bid window opening in November. If they won the bid, and Brennan said when, not if, the contract was $340 million over 4 years. The room nodded. Pat Riley, a former Ford vice president now in her late 60s, raised a hand from the far end of the table. She did not interrupt often, and when she did, the room paid attention. She wanted to know about the internal quality memo from January that had flagged a thermal margin concern in the battery pack. She wanted to know whether it had been resolved. Brennan answered without consulting his notes. The memo had been reviewed, the concern had been narrowed, the cell vendor had supplied an updated thermal profile, and the matter was closed. Pat held his eyes for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, then nodded once and lowered her hand. Della made a small note in the margin of her agenda and moved on. That evening, in the bay at Warren, a junior engineer named Diego mentioned the same thermal memo to Caleb in passing while they were closing out a service order. He did not know what it meant. He had only heard the phrase in a hallway and thought it sounded interesting. Caleb listened. He did not respond. When he got home that night, after Hazel was asleep, he opened a laptop he had not turned on in 19 months and began to sketch, by hand on a yellow legal pad, the schematic he remembered. Hazel wandered out for a glass of water at 10 and asked him what he was drawing. He folded the pad and told her gently that it was old work and walked her back to bed. The tech open house was scheduled for the second Thursday of the month. It was Della's idea. The Defense Procurement Office sent reviewers to events like these, and the company had invited industry press, a handful of Michigan state officials, and 3 mid-level officers from the Defense Logistics Agency to walk the floor and see the Aegis 7 up close. The whole point was to look serious without looking nervous. The morning went smoothly until 11 o'clock, when the tour reached the maintenance bays. Caleb had been running a routine pressure test on one of the prototype packs since 7. A single voltage line had been flickering yellow for the better part of an hour. Not red, yellow. He had paged Brennan twice. Brennan had not come down. When the tour stopped at the bay, Brennan finally arrived, smiling, gesturing toward the open hood of the demonstration vehicle. Caleb stepped between him and the press and said, quietly enough that the reporters did not initially hear, that he wanted to swap this car for the backup. The voltage on Cell Pack 3 was not stable. He did not want it on the floor with civilians around it. Brennan's smile did not move. He said, also quietly, that Caleb should review his reporting procedure. Then, more loudly, for the benefit of the man from the Defense Logistics Agency, he said that the vehicle had passed every check that morning. Della had been 3 steps behind. She heard the last exchange and stepped forward to close it. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. She turned to the press, smiled, and said that her engineers ran every system 3 times before showtime, which was why nothing ever went wrong on her floors. Then she turned to Caleb. Her voice was lower, but the entire tour heard her clearly. Mr. Ward, you'll never be more than a mechanic. Let the engineers do engineering. Please step aside. A photographer raised a camera. The shutter clicked once. Caleb did not look at it. He looked at Della for perhaps 2 seconds, the way a man looks at a closed door he could open if he wanted to, and then he nodded, stepped back, and walked out of the bay toward the supervisor's office at the far end of the building. Walt Briggs watched him go. Walt did not speak. He had seen this particular man absorb worse than this without flinching, and he knew Caleb would not say a word about it that night, or the next, or possibly ever. What no one noticed, because there was no reason to notice, was that the Defense Logistics Agency officer in the second row, a thin man in his 50s named Ray Calloway, had paused at the word Ward, then frowned, the way a man frowns when a name has caught on something in the back of his mind, and he cannot yet say what. He filed it away. He kept walking, 40 minutes later, the press tour ended with coffee and pastries and a polite question-and-answer session, and the demonstration vehicle on Cell Pack 3 was rolled quietly into a back bay and unplugged. The voltage line stopped flickering by lunchtime. No one mentioned it again. No one, that is, except Caleb, who wrote a memo about it that afternoon and filed it into the company ticket system. The memo was 4 pages long. It was titled, with no flourish, Thermal Risk Profile, Aegis 7 Cell Pack Module 14. It cited 2 prior internal quality reports, recalculated the margin at 3 operating temperatures, and recommended a sensor recalibration before commercial launch in September. It was technically clean, written in the unornamented language of someone who had once trained other engineers to write this way, and it was filed at 4:11 on a Tuesday afternoon under ticket number 84731. Within 90 minutes, it had been forwarded to Brennan Hale's queue. Within 3 hours, Brennan had marked it, reviewed, no action needed, attached a single sentence about the vendor's updated profile, and archived it. The ticket dropped off the active dashboard. The memo, in the way of memos that are not wanted, ceased to exist for practical purposes. Caleb had expected nothing else. He had filed it because filing it was what the procedure required, and procedure was the thing he believed in most after his daughter. He went back to the bay and did his job. He did not mention the memo to anyone. 2 weeks later, a warehouse forklift came in on a tow hook. 3 technicians, all of them younger than Caleb and at least one of them Tier 3, had spent 2 days on it without finding the fault. Caleb listened to it idle for 30 seconds, asked Walt for a particular wrench, and replaced a solenoid valve the size of a thumb. The forklift started on the first try. He cleaned his hands and went back to lunch. Walt watched him from the office doorway and said only, "Tier 2. Right." Caleb smiled, very briefly, and did not respond. The youngest of the 3 technicians, a kid named Diego, who had begun to suspect something was strange about the new maintenance hire, watched the exchange with the focused attention of a man trying to read a foreign word on a sign. That Friday, Hazel ran a fever of 101, and Caleb spent the morning in the waiting room at the pediatric clinic on Conant Street. While Hazel slept against his shoulder, his phone vibrated. It was the attorney who managed the small trust that held the rest of his life, the quiet life, the one that did not show up in his employee file. The attorney was calling to confirm that the quarterly dividend had cleared, that the conservative allocation had performed in line with projections, and that the principal remained, as of that morning, slightly over $62 million. Caleb said thank you. He listened to the rest of the report. He hung up. The young mother on the next chair did not look up from her phone. The following Monday, Diego approached him in the break room with 2 cups of bad coffee and asked, with the bluntness of a 26-year-old, where Caleb had studied. Caleb said a public school, a long time ago. Diego did not believe him. He did not push. That same week, Adelaide Monroe walked through the employee parking lot on her way back from a site review and noticed an old Ford F-150 parked between 2 newer cars. She registered dimly that the truck looked older than most of the people who worked at the facility, and then she forgot about it before she had reached her sedan. The memo by then was 12 days old. It was sitting in the company's archived ticket system, accessible to anyone with the right credentials, indexed by date, by author, by category, by every field the system had ever been designed to remember. It was, in the simplest possible way, evidence. 6 weeks after the memo was filed and forgotten, an Aegis 7, owned by a commercial leasing company in Indianapolis, caught fire inside a closed parking structure on a Tuesday morning. There was no one in the vehicle. There was no one in the structure. The sprinklers triggered and contained the fire to the single bay. A maintenance worker captured 90 seconds of phone video before the local fire department arrived. The video reached social media before the fire department reached the building. By 11 that morning, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration had opened a preliminary investigation. By 2 in the afternoon, Monroe Mobility's stock had dropped 18% across 2 trading sessions. By dinner time, the Defense Logistics Agency had quietly informed the company that the November bid would be paused pending an independent safety audit. The defense officer named Ray Calloway, the one who had filed the name Ward away in the back of his mind at the tech open house, was the one who delivered the call. Della convened a crisis meeting at 11 o'clock that night in the conference room on the 38th floor that overlooked the river. Brennan arrived first, with a deck already prepared. His proposal was decisive and calm. They would pause delivery of the remaining 200 vehicles, issue a precautionary advisory, and publicly attribute the failure to a single Korean cell vendor whose lot they had already identified. He had a draft of the press release. He had the name of the vendor. He had the legal theory for a recovery suit. He had thought of everything. Della read the deck twice. It was, on its face, the right answer. It assigned blame to a supplier, protected the company's engineering reputation, and gave the market a story it could finish in one news cycle. She picked up her pen to mark a single change. Pat Riley cleared her throat from the other end of the table. She was the only board member who had come in person at this hour, she said, in a voice that was not loud but was very level, that before the company assigned blame to any vendor, she wanted to see the internal quality memo from January, the original one, not the summary. She also wanted to see any memos that had been filed by anyone at any level regarding the thermal margin of the Aegis 7 cell pack in the past 6 months. All of them. Brennan said that of course she could have them, and that they would be assembled by morning. He smiled. He did not look at the deck again. Della did not put a mark on her page. She set the pen down. She did not know yet what Pat knew, or guessed, or feared, but she had been at this table long enough to know when a director was not asking a question for the first time. That same evening, 10 miles north in Hamtramck, Hazel was sitting cross-legged on the living room rug eating cereal when the local evening news cut to the video of the burning vehicle. The reporter said the make and model. Hazel turned her head and looked at her father, who was washing dishes at the sink. She asked him, in the voice 8-year-olds use for serious questions, whether he had made that car. Caleb dried his hands on a towel and came over and sat down across from her on the rug. He said no, he had not made that exact car, but he had worked on cars like it. Hazel thought about this for a long time. Then she said, "Then you know why it caught fire, right?" Caleb did not answer right away. He did not lie to his daughter. He simply said, "Maybe." And he reached out and smoothed her hair and got up to finish the dishes. The next morning at 7:45, Walter Briggs took the elevator to the 38th floor of Monroe Tower for the first time in 14 months of employment. He was wearing a clean blue shirt and the same boots he wore on the floor. The receptionist tried to ask him whom he had come to see, and he simply said Pat Riley and waited until Pat came out herself. Walt did not ask to see Della. He had read Della correctly. At this stage of a crisis, she was still listening primarily to Brennan, and Brennan would bury anything Walt said before it left the room. Pat, however, asked questions for a living. Walt placed a thin folder on her desk. Inside were 3 printouts. The first was Caleb Ward's memo, ticket 84731, all 4 pages, with the original timestamp. The second was Brennan Hale's archival comment, also timestamped. The third was a printout of the company's archive policy, which required all safety flag tickets to be retained for 7 years and reviewable by any board member upon request. Walt did not say who Caleb Ward had once been. He only said that the maintenance technician on his floor had flagged the exact failure mode 6 weeks before the vehicle in Indianapolis had burned, and that the COO had closed the ticket without further action. Then he left. He took the elevator back down. He did not stop in the lobby. Pat read the folder once. Then she called Adelaide Monroe and asked her, in a private voice, to come down the hall. Della read the memo standing up. She read it twice. The language in it was not the language of a Tier 2 maintenance technician. The calculations were not the calculations of a man who had only ever worked on chassis. By the time she had finished the second reading, she was no longer thinking about Indianapolis. She was thinking about the night, 6 months earlier, when she had told the man who had written this document that he would never be more than a mechanic. She did not say any of that to Pat. She thanked Pat for bringing it to her. She walked back to her office, closed the door, and stood at the window for 9 minutes. That evening at 6:15, instead of having Caleb summoned to the executive floor, Adelaide Monroe drove herself to the Warren facility and parked between 2 service trucks. She walked into the garage in a dark coat and dark jeans, and she found Caleb at Bay 9, wiping grease off his hands with a red shop rag. She asked him, without preamble, whether he had written the memo. He said yes. She asked who had taught him to calculate thermal margins like that. He said, "The man who taught me died a long time ago." Della stood there for a moment in the quiet hum of the bay. Then she said she wanted to read the original draft, not the version Brennan had archived. Caleb opened his locker. From inside, behind the thermos and the rag, he took out a 4-page printout he had kept from the day he had filed it. He handed it to her. His hand did not shake. His hand had not shaken in years. She took the pages. She looked at him a moment longer than was strictly necessary, the way a person looks at a building she has walked past every day for a year and is only now seeing clearly. Then she turned and walked back to her car. Walt watched the entire exchange from 20 feet away, leaning in the doorway of his office, arms folded. He did not say anything to Caleb when she left. He only nodded once. Caleb nodded back. The bay was quiet again. Della did not sleep that night. She read the 4 pages twice, then ordered Caleb Ward's employee file from Human Resources at 5 in the morning. The file was thin. Hired 14 months earlier. Tier 2. References listed only: Walter Briggs. Education line read City Tech, Phoenix, Arizona, 1996. There was no professional history before that. There was no professional history after. She entered his name into a search engine and found nothing useful. A real estate listing from 2004. A church bulletin from the late 90s. Nothing else. No professional network profile. No press. No conference photographs. A man who had not existed publicly in 20 years. At 7:30 she called her father. He was in his late 60s now, retired to a small house in Traverse City, and he was the only person she still called when she did not yet know what she was looking at. She asked him whether he had ever heard of an engineer named Caleb Ward. There was a pause on the other end of the line that lasted, by her count, about 4 seconds. Her father said, "Caleb Ward from Arden Powertrain." He told her, in the slow, careful way of a man recalling something he had not thought about in years, that Arden had been one of the first American firms to commercialize high-density battery packs for commercial fleets. He told her the company had been founded in 1999 by 3 people, and that the chief technology officer, the engineer of the 3, had been a young man named Caleb Ward. He told her that Arden had been acquired by Hanson Industrial in 2021 for a number neither of them needed to say aloud, and that the CTO had cashed out and walked away. There had been a reason. The man's wife had been sick. He had not given interviews. He had not been seen at industry events since. Della listened. She did not interrupt. When her father had finished, she thanked him, told him she would call again on the weekend, and hung up. She did not call her lawyer until 10 o'clock. When she did not ask the question she had been expecting to ask. She did not ask whether Caleb Ward stood to gain anything from the failure of Monroe Mobility. She asked, instead, whether anyone who licensed technology originally developed at Arden Powertrain still owed anything, directly or indirectly, to Caleb Ward personally. Her lawyer pulled the file. He called back at 12:20 in the afternoon. The answer was no. Caleb Ward had sold his entire stake in 2021. He had no equity, no royalty stream, no patent interest, no consulting agreement, no contingent right of any kind. He owned, in technical and legal terms, nothing of what had once been his. The man who had written the memo on her desk had no financial reason to write it. Della set the phone down on her desk and did not pick it up again for an hour. At 3 o'clock, she stood at the gate of a school she did not know, in a neighborhood she had never visited, watching a small girl with light brown hair come out of the building, run down the steps, and reach up for the hand of the man in the canvas jacket who was waiting for her. The girl was talking before she had finished crossing the sidewalk. The man bent down to hear her. Whatever she said, he smiled briefly, and they walked together toward an old truck at the end of the row. Della watched from her sedan, half a block away, and did not approach. She drove back to the office in silence. By the time she reached the 38th floor, she had understood something she had not understood that morning. The man at the school gate did not need anything from her. He had not written the memo to position himself. He had written it because he had once been the kind of person for whom writing it was the only available response. Della authorized an independent internal audit the following morning. She named Pat Riley to lead it. The audit was given access to every ticket in the company system, every email account, every expense filing, and every supplier contract for the past 3 years. It was given 11 days. The audit found 3 things. and only 3 things were necessary. It found, first, that Brennan Hale had archived as reviewed, no action needed, not only Caleb's memo, but 3 other memos in the past 18 months, 2 from quality engineers on the floor, and 1 from a junior actuary in finance, all raising concerns about the thermal margin of the Aegis 7 cell pack. None of those memos had been forwarded to the safety committee. None had reached the board. It found, second, that Brennan had routed 2 consulting contracts totaling $2.1 million to a pair of Delaware-registered shell companies whose beneficial ownership traced, after some patient legal work, to his ex-wife's brother. The work product associated with those contracts was thin. The invoices were not. It found, third, that Brennan had made 3 large personal transfers in the past 8 months to an offshore sportsbook and that he had been carrying a private gambling debt of slightly over $2.3 million since the previous spring, a fact his current wife did not know. The audit did not need to find anything else. Pat presented the findings to a closed board session on a Friday morning. There were no police officers. There were no agents. There were only the 11 directors, 2 outside counsel, Adelaide Monroe, at the head of the table, and Brennan Hale, who had been asked to attend without prior notice. Brennan tried to defend himself. He said the memos had been technically vague. He said the consulting contracts had been arm's length. He said the personal transfers were a private matter. He used the word context 3 times. Pat slid a single sheet of paper across the table. It was an email Brennan had sent to the head of quality the previous November. The line she had highlighted read, "Stop sending these. We don't have margin for delays." Brennan stopped speaking. Della did not raise her voice. She did not need to, she said, in a tone that the directors on either side of her would later describe as quieter than they had ever heard her be, that Brennan had not simply hidden a memo. He had bet her company against a cell module he had not understood. He was finished at Monroe Mobility, effective immediately, and the audit findings would be referred to outside counsel for civil action and to the appropriate authorities for review. Then she paused, and she said the line that the entire room would remember. The mechanic was right. You weren't. The board sat in silence for several seconds. Brennan looked at the table. He did not look up again before the meeting was adjourned. He submitted his resignation in writing within the hour. He did not contest the audit findings. He did not have anywhere to stand. Caleb Ward was not in the room. He was in Bay 9 at the Warren facility, replacing the brake calipers on the same warehouse forklift he had fixed 2 months earlier. Della drove down to tell him in person. She found him on his back, half under the forklift, the trouble light clipped to the axle. She waited until he slid out and sat up. She said simply that Brennan was out and that the audit had vindicated his memo. Caleb wiped his hands. He nodded once. He said, "I'm glad you read it." That was all he said. She stood there for a moment, the way she had stood at his locker the week before, the way she had stood across the street from his daughter's school the day after that, and then she nodded and walked back to her car. The drive back to Detroit took her 36 minutes. She did not turn on the radio. The next 6 months belonged to the slow weight of consequence. In January, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration formally requested a recall of all 412 Aegis 7 vehicles already in the field. Estimated cost to Monroe Mobility, including remediation and customer reimbursement, was $94 million. The company took the charge in a single quarter and absorbed it without protest. In February, the Defense Logistics Agency awarded the 4-year work vehicle contract to a competitor in North Carolina. The award was announced on a Wednesday morning in a single-sentence press release. Della read it in her car. She had been expecting it for weeks. It still hurt to read. In March, the company conducted 2 rounds of layoffs. 324 people, roughly 30% of headcount, were let go. Della delivered the news to the senior team in person and walked the floor in Warren and Toledo the same afternoon, looking each shift manager in the eye. Caleb Ward was not laid off. Walt Briggs, when asked, had said only that the maintenance organization could not function without him. He had not elaborated. No one had pressed. In April, the company's share price reached $6.40, down from a high of 41. A New York-based private equity firm circulated an unsolicited offer to acquire the company in full at a price that valued it slightly above book. Their plan, made discreetly clear in private meetings with 2 board members, was to break the company into three pieces, sell the technology rights, and wind down the Warren and Toledo facilities within 18 months. In May, the board met in emergency session. None of the existing major shareholders had the personal capital to mount a defense at the offered price. The private equity offer was, in the language of the room, the only offer on the table. In June, a second offer arrived. It came from a small trust headquartered in a converted brick building in Concord, Massachusetts. The trust was called Ward Family Holdings. The offer was 22% above the private equity bid. It included 3 commitments in writing. The brand would be retained. There would be no further layoffs for at least 18 months. The current chief executive officer would be invited to remain in operational leadership in a redefined role. Pat Riley called Della and told her to look at the signature line on the cover letter. Della looked. Caleb J. Ward, sole trustee. She did not stand up. She did not sit down harder. She had suspected since March, when she had begun to piece together how a man with no financial interest in the company could still have the means to act. She breathed in and out once. Then she called her father, and then she called her lawyer, and then she walked to her window and looked at the river for a long time. Caleb came up to the 38th floor of Monroe Tower for the first time in his life 2 days later. He wore the same canvas jacket, washed, and a clean shirt. He sat across from her in her office. He did not bring an attorney. He brought, on a single sheet of paper, 3 sentences. He said the company employed 4,700 people. He said his daughter could attend the public school near their apartment for another 5 years before she aged out. He said the private equity offer would carve up the building in 6 weeks, and he had the money, and he could not think of a better thing to do with it. He did not say anything else. Brennan Hale by then was 3 months into a civil suit he could not win. His Bloomfield Hills house had been listed for sale. His current wife had filed for divorce in April. The gambling debt remained. There was no dramatic ending for him. There was only the slow unraveling that real life prefers to the kind found in films, the kind in which a man loses, by degrees, everything he had quietly chosen to risk. The board approved the Ward Family Holdings offer in late June by a unanimous vote. Della did not respond to the offer letter immediately. She took a week. She spoke with her father twice. She walked the riverfront on 2 consecutive evenings, alone, and let herself think through what she wanted, which was a question she had not asked herself in nearly a decade. At the end of the week, she drove to the Warren facility without calling ahead. She found Caleb at Bay 7, teaching Diego how to calibrate a torque sensor on a steering column. She stood at the bay entrance until they were finished. Diego saw her first, took an unsubtle step backward, and excused himself to lunch. Caleb pulled off his gloves and looked at her. Della said, "Mr. Ward, I'd like to talk about the role." Caleb almost smiled. It was the first time in any of their interactions that the corner of his mouth had moved. He nodded toward the supervisor's office, and the 2 of them walked over together. And Walt, sensing the moment, found a reason to be elsewhere. They sat across the small metal desk from each other. She said she had been wrong about him 6 months earlier. He said she had not been wrong. She had not known. There was a difference. She offered to renegotiate compensation in line with prior chief executive terms. He declined the upward adjustment. He said he did not need additional money, and that the existing band was sufficient. She offered him the chair of the board. He declined that as well. He said he would sign what needed signing, and attend the quarterly meetings, and stay out of operations. The company already had an operator. She was sitting across from him. The terms were settled in less than 30 minutes. She drove back to Detroit. She did not turn on the radio. A month later, the company held an internal family day at the Warren facility. Children came with their parents. There were grilled hot dogs and a face-painting station and, near the entrance to the floor, a long bulletin board where the children had been asked, 2 weeks in advance, to submit a drawing for an internal contest. Hazel had brought one. Her teacher had asked the class to draw something they loved. She had drawn a small, dark blue truck with a man in a canvas jacket standing beside it. Della walked past the bulletin board around 2 in the afternoon, on her way to greet a regional manager from Toledo. She stopped. She read the small handwritten label in the bottom corner, Hazel W., Grade 3. She looked at the drawing for perhaps 10 seconds. She did not look for Caleb. She kept walking. Later, near the parking lot, Hazel ran up to her father, tugged his sleeve, and asked whether the woman in the white blouse near the front was his new boss. Caleb crouched down to her level. He told her that he and the woman worked together, and that neither of them was the other's boss. Hazel considered this for a moment, accepted it, and ran back toward the face-painting station. When Caleb stood up, he saw Adela 10 paces away, locking the door of her sedan. She had heard the question. She had not pretended otherwise. The two of them looked at each other across the asphalt. Adela nodded once. Caleb nodded back. Neither of them smiled. Neither of them looked away. 6 months earlier, she had told him he would never be more than a mechanic. She had been right in a way. He was still a mechanic. He kept the title on his badge for another year. What she had not understood, and what she understood now, was that a mechanic was sometimes the only person in the building who knew what the machine actually needed, and that the only mistake she had ever made was to forget, for one moment, that the work was the thing, not the title above it.